27 people had walked through that door. 27 people had collected their signing bonus paperwork, straightened their ties or smoothed their blazers, and told themselves that this time would be different, that they were the one who could handle it, that the rumors were exaggerated, that no CEO could possibly be as difficult as the Whisper Network made Emily Carter out to be. 27 people had been wrong. The last one, a sharp young man with 2 master's degrees and a portfolio of glowing references, had lasted exactly 43 minutes before setting his badge on the reception desk, offering a quiet apology to the woman at the front desk, and walking back out into the Manhattan morning without looking back. He did not call the agency to explain himself. He simply did not return. On the 48th floor of the Carter Global Tower, a glass and steel monument to ambition that rose above Midtown like a declaration of war against the ordinary Emily Carter, sat behind a desk that cost more than most people earned in a year and looked out at the city with an expression that had long since stopped resembling anything close to pleasure. She was 35 years old. She had been the youngest CEO in Carter Global's 60-year history. Business publications had profiled her twice before her 32nd birthday, and both times, the photographs had shown a woman who moved through the world with the kind of effortless authority that other people spent their entire careers trying to manufacture. That woman still existed in those photographs, perfectly preserved in glossy magazine pages, and Emily sometimes felt as though she were looking at someone she had never actually met. 2 years ago, on a rain-slicked Tuesday evening in November, a car had run a red light at the intersection of 5th Avenue and 53rd Street and changed everything. The impact had been catastrophic in the medical sense of the word: 2 fractured vertebrae, a cascade of neurological damage that the doctors had explained with careful, rehearsed compassion, and a prognosis that delivered its verdict in the gentlest possible terms, while meaning exactly what it said. Emily Carter would not walk again. She would use a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The company had sent flowers. The board had sent a very carefully worded letter expressing their collective confidence in her continued leadership. Her fiancé, Marcus, a venture capitalist whose affection had apparently been contingent on her ability to stand upright, had sent a different kind of message entirely delivered not in person, not even in a phone call, but in a text message that began with the words "I've been doing a lot of thinking," and ended with a silence so complete it had its own texture. She had not cried. She had read the message twice, set her phone face down on the hospital bed, and stared at the ceiling until the night nurse came in to check her vitals. That was the last time Emily Carter had allowed herself to be surprised by another person's capacity for abandonment. In the 2 years since the accident, she had become something that her former self would not have entirely recognized. The decisiveness was still there, the intelligence, the almost preternatural ability to read a room and understand the architecture of a business problem before anyone else had finished stating it. But a coldness had moved in alongside those qualities, had made itself at home, had rearranged the furniture. She spoke to her staff with the economy of someone who had stopped believing that warmth was an efficient use of time. She held people at a distance that she measured and maintained with the same precision she applied to quarterly projections. If someone looked at her wheelchair with pity, and people always looked, no matter how carefully they tried not to, she registered it with the flat, unimpressed attention of someone cataloging a predictable failure. She hated pity with a thoroughness that went beyond mere preference. It was, to her, a kind of violence, a declaration that the person standing before her had already decided what she was capable of, had already written the ending to a story she hadn't agreed to be in. She knew what they thought when they looked at her. She had heard it in the careful language of the board meetings, in the particular hesitancy with which people now phrased requests that would have once been delivered as straightforward directives. They thought she was diminished. They thought the accident had taken something essential from her beyond the obvious physical toll. Some of them, the ones who were either honest enough or careless enough to show their thoughts openly, clearly believed that it was only a matter of time before she stepped back, before the strain became too great, before the right external pressure was applied, and the whole careful structure she had rebuilt came apart. Richard Hayes, who carried the title of Executive Vice President with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had been born for a larger stage, was the most patient of these observers. He watched her from across conference tables with the measured attentiveness of someone who had calculated exactly how long he needed to wait. The morning the 27th assistant walked out, Richard had stopped by Emily's office under the pretext of reviewing a quarterly filing. He had not looked at her wheelchair. He had trained himself out of that particular tell, but Emily had watched his face and read what was underneath the careful professional neutrality, and it had confirmed everything she already believed about the people who surrounded her. When her head of human resources knocked on the door 30 minutes later and announced, with the brittle cheerfulness of someone delivering bad news they had practiced in the elevator, that they had found a new candidate for the personal assistant position, Emily had smiled the way a door closes on an empty room. "Send him in," she said. "He'll be gone by lunch." Cole Brooks had not expected to be standing in the lobby of the Carter Global Tower on a Wednesday morning in March. He had not expected many things that had become true over the past 3 years. And he had developed, through sheer accumulated necessity, a relationship with the unexpected that was less about acceptance and more about the practical understanding that falling apart was a luxury he could not afford. He was 38. He had spent 11 years as a project manager at a mid-sized engineering consultancy, building a reputation for staying calm in conditions that caused other people to lose their composure entirely, and then the consultancy had restructured in the particular way that companies restructured when they needed a word that meant something other than what it actually meant. And Cole had been handed a severance package and sent back into a job market that had grown considerably less hospitable in the the years since he had last needed to navigate it. His wife, Rachel, had died 14 months before that. Pancreatic cancer, which had announced itself late and moved quickly, in the way that particular disease often did, as though it had somewhere else to be. She had been 36. Their daughter Sophie had been 6 years old when Rachel died, and Cole had watched his daughter process a grief that was too large for her small body, with a fortitude that had broken his heart in a new way every single day. Sophie had her mother's eyes, a particular shade of gray-green that seemed to shift with the light, and she had Rachel's habit of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was thinking hard about something, and some mornings Cole would watch her eating breakfast and be ambushed by the resemblance so completely that he had to find something else to look at for a moment, had to busy his hands with the coffee or the dishes until the wave passed. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens that had felt exactly right when the 3 of them had been in it together, and now felt both too large and too small, in ways that defied straightforward explanation. The savings that were supposed to represent security, the careful accumulation of years of responsible financial behavior, had eroded in stages, first to cover the medical bills that insurance had declined in the precise language of contractual technicality, then to cover the ordinary costs of a life that did not pause for grief or job loss, and then, in smaller and smaller increments, to cover the gap between what Cole earned doing freelance project management work and what it actually cost to keep a child in school clothes and groceries, and the kind of ordinary stability that 8-year-old girls deserved to be able to take for granted. He had not told Sophie about the money. She was 8. She should not have to know about money the way Cole had come to know about it, as a constant, low-frequency sound in the background of every decision. Sophie had, in the way that children sometimes did, understood more than he had told her. She was not naive, she was perceptive, and she noticed when her father's laugh came a half-second later than it should have, when his attention drifted in the middle of conversations, when he sat at the kitchen table after she was in bed with papers spread in front of him, and an expression on his face that he had not yet learned to put away before she came looking for a glass of water. One evening, a few weeks before the Carter Global opportunity had materialized, she had climbed into the chair beside him and put her hand over his on the table, and told him that she didn't need new things, that she didn't need the birthday trip to the aquarium she'd mentioned, that she just needed him to stay. He had held it together until she was back in bed. He was less successful after. The position had come through a former colleague, a man named Derek, who had worked with Cole at the consultancy and had maintained an unusually thorough network of professional relationships across every industry sector he had ever touched. Derek had texted on a Sunday evening the kind of text that opens with, "Don't say no right away," and described the position in terms that were simultaneously enticing and alarming. Personal executive assistant to Emily Carter, CEO of Carter Global. Compensation package that was, Derek admitted, genuinely exceptional. Working conditions that were, Derek also admitted, genuinely terrible. 27 predecessors. A reputation that preceded itself by several miles. Cole had sat with his phone for a long time, scrolling past the text without responding, while Sophie slept in the next room, and then he had looked at the photograph on his nightstand, Sophie at the beach, 2 summers ago, Rachel standing behind her with both hands on their daughter's shoulders, and a smile that contained the whole world, and he had texted Derek back. He had dressed carefully that morning. Not to impress, he was past the age at which he believed the right tie could determine an outcome. But because Rachel had always said that how you dressed was a message you sent to yourself, not just to the room, he had taken the subway in from Queens and walked the last 6 blocks in a light March rain and stood in the lobby and looked up at the elevator bank and thought, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived before something significant, this is going to be harder than anything Derek told me. He was not wrong. Emily Carter looked at Cole Brooks for approximately 4 seconds when he was shown into her office, and in those 4 seconds, she performed the assessment she performed on every new assistant, reading the body language, the posture, the quality of attention in the eyes, the particular flavor of nervousness or overconfidence that almost everyone brought into this room. Cole Brooks stood in her doorway and looked back at her. And the thing that registered first was that he was not nervous. He was attentive in the way that people who have survived genuinely difficult things are attentive, a kind of calm that had been earned rather than performed. Emily did not like it. It did not fit the pattern. She did not greet him. She slid a folder across the desk without looking up from her screen. I need these reports reformatted and cross-referenced with the Kone projections. The presentation template is wrong. Fix it. The board meeting is in 3 hours. It was not a reasonable timeline. It was not meant to be. The previous 27 assistants had either frozen at this point or had begun the particular kind of anxious over-explanation that Emily found even more exhausting than incompetence, the lengthy negotiation of what was and wasn't possible, the hedging, the seeking of reassurance. Cole picked up the folder. He looked at it for a moment, with the expression of someone calculating the actual requirements of a task, rather than its emotional weight, and he said, simply, I'll need access to the server for the projection files. Emily told him the credentials. He left. She waited for the follow-up questions, the return visit for clarification, the knock on the door that would tell her this had already gone wrong. It didn't come. He had the reformatted reports on her desk in 2 hours and 40 minutes. They were correct. They were, if she was being precise about it, better organized than the template she had given him, improved in a way that was both immediately legible and that she had not asked for. She did not compliment him. She went through the documents with a pen and found 2 items she wanted. Changed minor items, the kind of thing that anyone reasonable would have let go, and sent him back to make the corrections. He made them without comment. When her afternoon scheduler turned out to conflict with a call she had forgotten she'd agreed to, she gave Cole the task of reorganizing it, with a tone that did not leave obvious room for anything except immediate compliance, and he reorganized it efficiently and accurately, and went back to his desk and continued working. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when the last of the daylight was cutting sharp angles across the office floor, and most of the staff had begun their careful, quiet retreat toward the elevators, Emily realized that the day had passed, and Cole Brooks was still at his desk. She had not expected that. The not expecting it was its own small aggravation. She wheeled herself to the doorway of the outer office. Cole was at his computer, still working. With the particular focused ease of someone who was not thinking about the impression he was making, because he was too busy actually doing the work. "Why are you still here?" she said. It came out flatter than a question, closer to a challenge. Cole looked up. There was nothing defensive in his expression. Nothing that was either reaching toward her approval or bracing against her disapproval. "I'm finishing the logistics summary you asked for this morning," he said. "I'll have it to you in 20 minutes. Emily looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Fine," she said. and turned back to her office, and sat at her desk in the gathering dark, and thought about the fact that she didn't have a word for what she was feeling. It was not, precisely, surprise. It was something stranger than surprise. It was the mild disorientation of a pattern she had relied on, failing to materialize. There were wounds in Emily Carter that no one was allowed to see, and she had become very good at ensuring that remained the case. The professional armor was real. It had been built from the same raw materials as her actual competence, and it was, in its way, as impressive as anything else she had accomplished. But there were nights in the office, after the last assistant had left, and the building had settled into its strange nocturnal quiet, when she allowed herself to be something other than the version of herself that the company needed her to be. She kept a photograph in the bottom left drawer of her desk, not prominently displayed, not framed on the credenza like the industry awards and the commemorative covers. Hidden, the photograph was from 4 years ago, taken at a beach house in the Hamptons during a long weekend that had felt, in retrospect, like a different lifetime. In it she was standing, weight easy on both feet, entirely unaware of the fact that standing was something she would one day be unable to do, and she was laughing at something out of frame, and beside her was a man with his arm around her shoulders and an expression on his face that had once seemed like a promise. Marcus had not been a villain in the way that word usually arranged itself in a story. He had simply discovered, in the hospital room where Emily had been given her prognosis, that the life he had been planning required a partner who could move through it in a specific way, and that he was not, at bottom, the kind of person who would be capable of rearranging that plan. He had told himself a story about it that she imagined made him feel like less of a coward, something about her needing space to heal, about not wanting to hold her back, about the particular kind of cruelty that dressed itself up as consideration. She had understood his logic. That had been the most painful part. Understanding exactly how a person arrived at a decision that devastated you did not make the devastation smaller. It just left you with nowhere to direct it. Cole did not know about Marcus. He did not know about the photograph in the drawer. He did not know that the efficient, relentless, frost-edged CEO who sent him terse instructions at 11:30 at night was also, in the particular silence of the empty office, someone who sometimes sat still for a long time, with her hands in her lap, and felt the weight of a life that had been rebuilt from rubble and still, on certain evenings, felt like rubble. He found out, on the 3rd week of his employment, not because she told him anything, but because he happened to stay late to complete a document she needed for an early meeting, and when he came back through the corridor to drop it on her desk, he saw her through the glass panel of the office wall. She had the drawer open. She was looking at the photograph. She did not know he was there. He could have done many things in that moment. He could have knocked, introduced himself into the scene, forced it into a shape that required her to respond. He could have retreated entirely, filed the document in the morning and said nothing. What he did instead was set the completed document on the small table outside her door, walk to the kitchen at the end of the corridor, make a cup of tea. He had noticed, over the course of 3 weeks, that she drank chamomile in the evenings, that she preferred it without sugar, that she left the tag hanging over the side of the cup and carry it back to the table outside her office. He knocked once, lightly, set the cup down when she said come in, told her the document was ready whenever she needed it, and left. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer a comment on what he had or hadn't seen. He simply provided the cup of tea and went back to his desk and let her have the moment without requiring anything from her in return. Emily sat with the cup of tea in her hands and felt something shift very slightly in the architecture of her defenses. Not collapse, nothing so dramatic as that, but a loosening, barely perceptible, like the first degree of give in a structure that has been under sustained pressure for a very long time. She did not tell Cole about the photograph, but she thought about the cup of tea for the rest of the week, and what it meant that someone had noticed something about her, without turning that noticing into a transaction. The day Sophie came to the office was not planned. It was a Thursday, in late April, the kind of spring day that Manhattan produces occasionally, and without apology, clear and warm, with a quality of light that made the city look like it had been washed and hung out to dry. Cole got the call from Sophie's school at 10:15 in the morning. Her temperature was 102. She needed to be picked up. He came to Emily's doorway with the expression of a man who had run the calculation several times in quick succession and not arrived at a clean answer. He explained the situation concisely. He offered to work remotely for the remainder of the day. He said he could arrange for Sophie to go to a neighbor's apartment if Emily needed him to stay. Emily looked at him and understood, with the irritation of someone who did not want to be perceptive at that particular moment, that he was trying to make himself as small as possible, trying to take up as little of her consideration as he could, and that this was not the behavior of a man who was trying to manipulate her, but of a man who had become accustomed to navigating a world that did not leave much room for his inconveniences. "Bring her here," Emily said. She was not entirely sure, in the moment of saying it, why she said it. Sophie Brooks arrived at the Carter Global Tower 45 minutes later, wearing a purple jacket over her school uniform and carrying a stuffed rabbit with one eye, and she was running 102 fever and still managed to look around the lobby with an expression of uncomplicated wonder. Cole brought her up to the 48th floor and settled her on the small couch in the outer office, with a blanket he found in the supply closet and a glass of ginger ale from the kitchen, and Sophie accepted these arrangements with the easy adaptability of a child who had learned that circumstances changed and that the best response was usually to work with what you had. She fell asleep within 20 minutes. Cole went back to work. An hour later, Emily rolled past the outer office, and Sophie was awake, sitting up with her rabbit in her lap and looking at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows with the expression of someone who has discovered something genuinely extraordinary. She became aware of Emily at the same moment that Emily became aware of her. She looked at the wheelchair with the natural curiosity of a child. Direct, interested, free of the particular self-consciousness that adults deployed around disability, like a kind of social armor. And then she looked at Emily's face and said, with the calm certainty of someone stating a fact about the weather, "You're really pretty." Emily, who had not been told anything of the kind in so long that she had genuinely stopped keeping track, opened her mouth and found that she had nothing ready. Sophie tilted her head, the way Cole did sometimes, and added, "Do you live up here?" Emily heard something come out of her mouth that she slowly recognized as a laugh. Not the controlled professional sound she sometimes produced in meetings, a real laugh, short and genuine, surprised out of her by the question. "No," she said. "I work here." Sophie considered this. "That seems lonely," she said. There was no strategy in it, no calculation, no gentleness deployed to achieve an effect. Sophie said the thing that was true, in the way that 8-year-olds said things that were true, without the filtration system that adults constructed over years of learning which truths were safe to speak aloud. Emily sat with the remark and found that she did not want to deflect it. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "I suppose it is." Sophie moved over on the small couch in an invitation that required no words. Emily hesitated for only a moment before positioning her wheelchair alongside it. They sat together for a while, looking at the city, and Sophie showed Emily the stuffed rabbit, whose name was apparently Mr. Buttons, though one of the buttons was missing, and explained the rabbit's extensive personal history with the serious biographical commitment of a documentarian. Emily listened. Cole, watching from his desk with the careful peripheral attention of a father who knew when not to intervene, felt something he had not felt in a long time. The particular, specific warmth of watching two people he cared about find each other across a distance he hadn't known how to close. By the end of the afternoon, Sophie's fever had come down. She had colored 2 pictures at the small conference table in the outer office, one of Mr. Buttons, and one that she presented to Emily with the formality of a professional handing over a deliverable. Emily looked at the picture. A woman in what appeared to be a silver vehicle of some kind, surrounded by what Sophie explained were stars. "You're in a space car," Sophie said, as though this were a perfectly straightforward representation of Emily's situation. "Because you can go anywhere." Emily held the picture for a long time. After Sophie and Cole had gone home, she put it on her desk where she could see it. Richard Hayes had been at Carter Global for 19 years. He was 51 years old, and had spent most of his adult professional life convinced that he was the most capable executive in the building, and that the primary obstacle between him and real power was the intractable fact of not being a Carter. Emily's accident had changed the equation. Not immediately, she had returned to work with a speed and determination that forestalled the most obvious challenges, but as the pressures accumulated and the whisper network around her management style continued to generate departing assistants and quietly alarmed board members, Richard had begun to understand that the moment he had been waiting for was no longer hypothetical. He had allies, board members who owed him favors, senior managers who would vote the way he suggested if he suggested it with sufficient confidence, and a financial journalist who had twice written pieces that served interests other than purely journalistic ones. The strategy was simple. Doubt was cheap to create. Once created, it compounded. The first article ran on a Tuesday morning in May. It was the kind of piece that was careful about what it asserted directly and generous in what it implied questions about Carter Global's strategic direction. Anonymous sources close to the board noting concerns about leadership stability, a mention of the string of departing assistants that managed to be both accurate in the facts and entirely dishonest in the interpretation it invited. Emily read it at 6 in the morning in her apartment and felt the particular cold clarity of someone who recognizes an attack that has been coming for a long time and has arrived with better timing than she would have liked. By 9 o'clock, there were calls from 3 board members requesting a meeting. By 11, a major institutional shareholder had reached out to the investor relations team. Cole saw the article before he came into the office. He read it the way he read documents, when something in them felt wrong twice, carefully, with attention to the specific word choices and the sources and the structural architecture of the argument, and he arrived at the Carter Global Tower with the article printed out and annotated. He did not tell Emily he had concerns. He spent the first 2 hours of the morning working back through a set of financial disclosures that Richard's team had submitted over the previous quarter, cross-referencing them against the originating documents in the system. The numbers did not match. They matched well enough that a casual review would miss the discrepancy. It was not the careless error of someone who didn't understand what they were doing. It was the precise deviation of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and had bet that no one would look closely enough. He brought what he had found to Emily at 2 in the afternoon. He laid it out without drama. The documents, the discrepancies, the timeline of the altered figures, the pattern that became visible only when you looked at all of it together. Emily sat across from him and went through each item with the focused attention of someone who was recalibrating, in real time, a significant number of prior assumptions. When she was done, she looked up. Cole was watching her with the quiet steadiness that she had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but rather its very disciplined management. "You've been sitting on this," she said. "Not an accusation. En observation. I wanted to be certain," he said. "Are you?" He nodded once. Emily looked at the documents for another moment, and then she looked at Cole, and something that had been carefully maintained as a purely professional relationship underwent a structural shift that neither of them acknowledged in words, but both of them felt with complete clarity. "Then we're going to need to be careful about how we use this," she said. Cole said, "I know. I've already thought about that." Emily said, quietly, "We." Cole met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "We." They worked through the investigation with the systematic precision of 2 people who had learned that the distance between what is true and what can be proven is a gap that requires careful, unglamorous work to close. Cole identified a former junior analyst in Richard's division, a young woman who had left the company 8 months earlier. Under circumstances she had declined to discuss publicly, and reached out through professional channels. Emily requested an external audit of the financial reports in question, framing it in language that revealed nothing of what she already knew. They did not discuss what they were doing in the office. They communicated in brief, precise messages that would mean nothing to anyone reading them without context. In the middle of it, in the strange, sustained pressure of those weeks, when the board's unease was generating regular anxious calls, and the business press was beginning to circle with the particular hunger of journalists who sensed that a larger story is developing. Something else was happening that neither of them was fully naming. They spent a great deal of time together. Late evenings reviewing documents in Emily's office, early mornings when Cole would arrive to find Emily already at her desk with coffee, and the specific focused stillness of someone who had not entirely slept. Sophie came to the office twice more when school schedules and logistics required it, and each time she treated Emily with the easy familiarity of someone who did not make distinctions between people based on the particular containers their lives had been placed in. She braided Emily's hair once, with great concentration, while Cole worked at the next table and pretended not to notice. The result was structurally imperfect, and Emily wore it for the rest of the afternoon. One evening, late, when the city below was doing its full illuminated performance and the office had long since emptied, Cole said something that he had been thinking about for a while without meaning to. They had been talking about the case, about how close they were to having everything they needed, and the conversation had shifted, the way conversations sometimes did in late hours, into something less structured. Emily had said something about the accident, not directly, but in a way that touched the edge of it, referencing a version of herself that had existed before it with the detached precision of someone describing a third party. And Cole had listened, and when she was finished he said, "The accident didn't take away who you are. You brought all of that with you." Emily looked at him. She was not used to being told things that were both simple and true simultaneously. She said, "That's a very straightforward thing to say to someone." Cole said, "It's a very straightforward thing to believe." And Emily, who had not cried in front of another person since the hospital 2 years ago, who had built a functional fortress against the particular vulnerability of being witnessed in her grief, felt her eyes fill with something she did not fully manage to prevent. Cole did not look away. He did not perform the delicate social act of pretending not to notice. He simply held her gaze with the quiet steadiness of someone who had no agenda attached to what he was seeing, who did not need her to manage herself for his comfort. Emily let herself cry for approximately 45 seconds. It was not, in any dramatic sense, a catharsis. But it was real, and it was the first thing in 2 years that had been fully real between her and another adult person. Richard Hayes had spent the 3 weeks before the board meeting with the focused intensity of someone executing a final move. He had secured the support of 4 board members enough, combined with the press-generated anxiety, to make a vote for leadership review a genuine possibility. He arrived at the boardroom with the controlled satisfaction of a man who had waited years for a specific moment and could finally see it clearly. Emily entered from the opposite door, positioned herself at the head of the table with the ease of someone sitting down to a meeting she expected to control, and looked at Richard across the polished conference table long enough to let him understand that whatever he had prepared, she had prepared something for it. She let him speak first. She let him lay out the narrative he had constructed with the patience of someone who knows that the best time to address a lie is after it has been fully told. Richard was thorough and composed, and genuinely impressive in the way that people who had spent years planning for a moment could be. When he finished, the silence in the room was one he clearly mistook for effect. Cole entered through the side door with a presentation binder, a portable drive, and the particular calm of a man who had learned the difference between anxiety and its absence, and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to function from the latter. He set the materials on the table. Emily had already introduced him to the board by email the previous afternoon. He opened the presentation. What followed took 40 minutes. The external audit results, the documented discrepancies across 3 years of financial reporting, the testimony of the former analyst, given formally and on record with legal representation, the communications between Richard and the financial journalist. It was not a complicated story. Once you could see all of it, the complexity had been artificial, carefully constructed to discourage close examination. Richard looked at the materials with the expression of a man watching a building he believed was structurally sound begin to come apart. The board members who had been his allies looked at each other, and then at their phones, and then at the documents in front of them, calculating with some urgency how far they were from the exit. By the time the meeting ended, the vote for leadership review had been tabled indefinitely. A separate motion to commission a formal investigation into the financial irregularities passed unanimously, including the votes of the 4 members who had arrived that morning, expecting to vote for something entirely different. Richard Hayes was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He left the building that afternoon in the company of 2 members of the legal team, and a silence that had its own finality. Emily watched him go from the window of her office, 48 floors above the street, and felt something that was not triumph too mixed with exhaustion, and the residual ache of having to fight for something that should not have required fighting for. But underneath the exhaustion there was solidity. The sense of a floor existing where she had for some time been unable to find one. She turned from the window. Cole was still at his desk, filing the documentation. The day's proceedings had generated the unheroic practical work that follows every dramatic event. Emily watched him for a moment. He worked the way he did everything, with focused, steady attention, not performing the activity but simply doing it. She thought about the cup of tea left outside her office door. She thought about the 43 minutes he had lasted on that first morning, before she had fully understood he was not going to leave. She thought about Sophie's drawing the woman in the silver vehicle, surrounded by stars, going anywhere. Cole came into her office at 6 o'clock, after the last of the legal team had left, and told her that everything was filed and that he thought they were in good shape for the morning. He spoke with the measured professionalism that had characterized every interaction across the months of their working together, and Emily recognized, with a precision that felt physical, that this was about to change not because anything bad had happened, but because something had been building that they had both been treating as a professional relationship, because it was, technically, a professional relationship, and because the alternative required a kind of courage that was different from the courage of boardroom confrontations. Cole was moving toward the door. He had his jacket in his hand. Emily said his name. He turned back. She had planned, in a loose sense, what she wanted to say. The plan involved a certain amount of framing context, acknowledgement of the circumstances, a careful scaffolding that would allow both of them to understand what was being offered, without anyone being exposed unnecessarily. The plan dissolved when she looked at his face and understood that the scaffolding was unnecessary, that he already knew what she was trying to say and was simply waiting for her to say it. "I don't need an assistant," she said. Cole looked at her with the quiet attentiveness she had come to understand. Was his version of full presence complete, unguarded, without the performance of it? "I know," he said, and waited. Emily said, "I need you." Cole was still for a moment. Then he set his jacket down on the chair beside the door, and said, "I know that too." They did not kiss that evening. They did not make any declarations that had the formal quality of declarations. What happened was quieter and more durable, a conversation that went on for 2 hours in the empty office, the city doing its night performance below them, that moved through all the things they had both been thinking about without saying, and arrived somewhere that neither of them could have precisely described, but that both of them recognized as solid ground. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Emily would have rejected a fairy tale on principle, and Cole would have been suspicious of anything that came without cost. What they built together had the texture of real things, which meant real work, real patience, real willingness to show up in the difficult moments as well as the easy ones. Emily's physical therapy was ongoing. There were weeks when progress felt real, and weeks when it felt theoretical. She learned, slowly and without particular grace, how to accept help that wasn't pity, how to let Cole be present without interpreting his presence as an indictment of her capacity. It was harder than she had anticipated. She did it anyway. Sophie came to the apartment on Saturday mornings. This had begun as a practical arrangement. Cole's work schedule occasionally required flexibility, and Emily had a large apartment and had, in a moment of impulsive generosity that she later decided to stand behind, extended an open invitation. Sophie had accepted it with the straightforward enthusiasm of a child who evaluated offers based on their merits rather than their social complexity. She brought Mr. Buttons. She brought her coloring books. She occasionally brought a friend from school and introduced her to Emily with the proprietary confidence of someone showing off something she was proud of. Emily found, to her own mild astonishment, that she did not mind. She found, going further than not minding, that Saturday mornings had become something she looked forward to, that Sophie's presence in her apartment had changed the quality of the weekend in a way she couldn't have engineered deliberately and would not have been able to predict. Sophie asked the question on a Saturday evening in September, when the three of them were in Emily's kitchen making dinner with the comfortable inefficiency of people who are enjoying themselves. Sophie was sitting on the counter. Emily had been talked into allowing this, against her initial instinct, by a sustained campaign of reasonable argument, and Cole was at the stove, and Emily was slicing tomatoes at the island, and the kitchen smelled like garlic, and the radio was playing something that Sophie had selected, which meant it was upbeat in a way that Emily would not have chosen independently, but had come to associate with the particular warmth of these evenings. Sophie looked at Emily with the steady, considering expression she had inherited from her father and said, "Could you be my mom?" The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Cole turned from the stove, and Emily saw in his face, not surprise exactly, but a quality of complete attention, a stillness, a willingness to hold whatever was about to happen with whatever it required. Sophie waited with the patient confidence of someone who had asked a genuine question and expected a genuine answer. Emily set down the knife. She felt the fullness that arrived in her chest sometimes in the middle of these evenings, the thing she had spent 2 years believing she did not deserve, the ordinary warmth of being a person in a life that contained other people. Her eyes were wet. She was aware of this and did not try to correct it. She looked at Sophie, and then at Cole, and then back at Sophie, and she said, "I would really like that." Sophie nodded, satisfied in the way that children were satisfied when something they had intuited was confirmed. Cole put down the wooden spoon and crossed the kitchen and took Emily's hand. And the three of them remained like that for a moment in the kitchen that smelled like garlic, with the radio playing Sophie's song, the city going on outside the windows, with its complete indifference to the small human miracle that was occurring on the 8th floor of a building in the East 80s. It was not a dramatic moment. It was better than dramatic. It was true. Emily Carter did not regain the use of her legs. This is not a story about that kind of recovery, and she would have said so plainly. She had recovered something more fundamental, had found, or perhaps built for the first time, the understanding that her life was not a problem to be solved, but a thing to be lived, with the full complexity and occasional devastation and genuine joy that living actually required. She ran Carter Global through 3 significant expansions and 1 genuinely difficult contraction that tested everything she had rebuilt since the boardroom confrontation. She kept Sophie's drawing in a frame on her desk, the woman in the silver vehicle, going anywhere next to a photograph taken on a Tuesday in October, 3 years after Cole's first day, in the garden of the courthouse where they married. Cole's hand was on Emily's shoulder. Sophie, at 11, wore a dress she had selected with considerable conviction and held Mr. Buttons by one ear and squinted slightly into the sun. Emily was laughing with her whole face, the way she had laughed in the old magazine photographs, except that this laugh knew something the old ones hadn't. It knew the cost of arriving at a Tuesday in October, with 2 people you loved and sunlight, and a life that was yours. Cole Brooks had walked into the Carter Global Tower on a Wednesday morning in March because his daughter needed him to, and had stayed because the work was unfinished, and had remained because something in him recognized, in Emily Carter, a person who had survived something terrible and was doing so alone, and who did not, despite everything she believed, need to. He had not saved her. She had not needed saving. What had happened between them was something quieter and more difficult and more lasting than rescue, a choice, made by both of them, repeatedly and in small ways and in large ones, to refuse the easier path of absence. To remain. To show up. To hold the cup of tea and wait. There are wounds that the eye cannot see. There are rooms in a person closed for so long that the person has stopped remembering what they contained. There are 27 ways to leave and 1 way to stay. And the one way is harder than all the others, but it is the only one that matters. Sometimes the thing that changes everything is not a grand gesture or a dramatic reversal. Sometimes it is a Wednesday morning and a folder of reports with an unreasonable deadline, and a man who looks at you and sees what you are still capable of rather than what you have lost. Sometimes it is a cup of chamomile tea left outside a closed door without comment or condition. Cole had told Sophie, once, when she was old enough to ask, and young enough to ask without self-consciousness, why he had stayed at the Carter Global Tower, on that first day when everyone else had left. He thought about it carefully before answering, the way he always did when Sophie's questions deserved a real answer. Because when things are hard, you don't leave, he said. You find out what's needed, and you do it. Sophie considered this. Then she said, "Is that what Mommy did?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what Mommy did." Later, when Emily had come home to the apartment that had become their apartment to the kitchen and the radio and Mr. Buttons on the shelf above the fireplace, Sophie told her this story too. Emily listened, and then she found Cole, and they stood together in the early evening light and held that truth between them, neither of them alone. And that, in the end, was the whole story, not the drama of the boardroom, not the confrontation or the documents or the vote that turned. But this, a girl in a kitchen on an ordinary evening, with two people who had built something real in the space between loss and the refusal to stop. Sometimes the thing that saves a person is not a miracle. Sometimes it is simply one person who decides not to leave when everything would be easier if they did.